Okay, thank you all so much for joining us on your Wednesday night. I'm the Carbon Farming Outreach Program Coordinator, Tani Burgess, and this webinar is our fourth on carbon farming and looking at the benefits it can have on your farms. Tonight, we'll be covering calculating your on-farm emissions with Cam Nicholson, Kerri, Robson, and Julian Carroll. So thank you all so much for joining us. This webinar is part of a broader program. So we're working together with AgVic, the 10 catchment management authorities, to run carbon farming outreach events all across the state. So I really encourage you to take a look at our webpage and see if there's any events coming up near you. And it's all aimed to help Victorian farmers understand their emissions and the benefits of carbon farming. We have a massive amount to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump straight into it. Firstly, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we work of Landcare Victoria occurs. We're inspired by the legacy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as this land's first custodians. And tonight I'm coming to you from Naarm on Wurundjeri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. As a few housekeeping points, you can ask questions anytime of our presenters through the Q&A function. I know we're going to have lots of questions, so I really encourage you to get in early, as it means we're going to be more likely to get to them. You can also comment or upvote on other people's questions. My colleague Sarah is also here from Landcare Victoria tonight to help manage the questions and make sure we can get to as many as we can. So I just wanted to also give a quick note to say you should save the date for our next webinar, carrying on from this one. It will be Planning for Your Farm Future with Alice and Kelly. It'll be on September 17th, so keep an eye on our emails and socials to get a little bit more information closer to the date. But let me get started by introducing our first speaker for tonight. Cam Nicholson is an agronomist who's been consulting in the ag industry for 40 years and is director of the consulting business Nikon Rural Services. Cam and his wife Fiona Conroy run a self-replicating commercial performance recorded Angus herd and a superfine wool merino flock with a focus on productivity, animal welfare and environmental management on the Bellarine Peninsula. Cam and Fiona have had a long interest in improving, measuring and understanding the benefits from managing the natural resources on their farm. Their main focus has been on soil, water, vegetation and fauna. More recently, they've become interested in understanding the opportunities and future market challenges around carbon accounting and reporting. Cam, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Fine, thanks, Tani. All right, I will share my screen and we'll hook into it.
Great.
So first of all, good evening, everybody. Tani's asked me to cover a few things around the carbon accounting, but also very much from a productivity, profitability type angle. And then move into some of the calculators that are available and the pros and cons of those, particularly a new calculator, online calculator that's being developed at the moment. But I just want to start by making sure we're all on the same page around what we call the net carbon equation. And some people have probably seen this before, but when we're doing our accounting or our calculations, we refer to them as in terms of what we call scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the easiest way to think about those are the emissions that occur within your farm boundary. And there are 3 greenhouse gases that we're interested in understanding and quantifying. One is methane, which is CH4, primarily coming from livestock. So sheep and cattle, if you've got them, then they will be producing methane, mainly from what they breathe out after they've eaten their feed, but also we do get some methane from as the manure breaks down as well. The second source of greenhouse gases is in nitrous oxide, which come from fertilizer, also come from urine and dung. So the more or the higher the protein in the diet, the more that we'll get nitrous oxide coming from that urine and dung, and also the breakdown of crop residues if you're in a cropping situation. And then we have carbon dioxide as well, mainly from electricity. A little bit comes from urea, but a fair bit does come from anybody that's liming, because lime is calcium carbonate, and as it deacidifies the soil or reacts with the hydrogen ions in the soil, it produces carbon dioxide. So using that, we actually get pinged for carbon dioxide emissions because we're putting a solid product then into a gaseous form. What's important to realise that in agriculture we produce very little carbon dioxide. It mainly comes from nitrous oxide and from methane. So if you look at Australia's inventory and where agriculture fits in that, we only produce about 1% of Australia's carbon dioxide emissions. But we produce over half of our methane that's produced, and we produce over 75% of the nitrous oxide that's produced. Now, what's important in these is the three gases are different in the way they behave. And so it's the way they reflect heat once it comes into the earth and reflects or bounces back off again, and how much of it traps. Nitrous oxide being very strong in its trapping effect. Methane less so, but still important. And so when we do a calculation, we try and compare the three gases, and we talk about them in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So the standard is that we call carbon dioxide 1, and it's a bit like if you can think of a DSE rating that you'd have on your farm. The carbon dioxide is a DSE rating of 1, that's the dry sheep equivalent. And then we rate what's the impact of a molecule of those other gases in warming the planet over 100 years compared to carbon dioxide. So nitrous oxide, the N2O1, warms the planet 265 times more so than carbon dioxide over 100 years. So that means we could put the equivalent of 1 nitrous oxide in the atmosphere or 265 carbon dioxides in the atmosphere, and it would have the same effect over a 100-year period. With methane, it's 28 times carbon dioxide. So the gases we produce in agriculture, the methane and the nitrous oxide, while we don't produce a lot of them, they have a high warming effect. So the impact or the contribution of agriculture is high because of these other gases that aren't necessarily carbon dioxide. What's important in that is we convert them, so we will talk in our calculations about carbon dioxide equivalents. So it's those other gases converted as if they were carbon dioxide, the equivalent in carbon dioxide. So we have these scope 1 and 2 emissions of those gases. We also can consider some changes in carbon sequestration, and this is new carbon, and so it's important that it is not what's existing, but what we add to the carbon stocks going forward. And the primary sources of those is in trees, vegetation, and in soils as part of that. So if you think we emit on one side of it, we sequester some carbon or capture some carbon in carbon dioxide in the other side of it. And so we get this net farm emissions or a footprint of what occurs on our farm. And so that's that ledger between emissions on one side and sequestration, a bit like a bank balance. Your emissions being what you're spending and your sequestration is what your income is. And the balance of that is whether our net emissions are negative or positive. Just one other thing I'll just mention is that we need to be aware, though, when we talk about or think about sequestration, that there are times when those sequestration activities may not be positive. So, for example, if trees that have captured carbon burn down, they release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And soils in particular can be variable particularly around runs of climatic conditions. So a number of dry years and droughts and things like that, our soil carbons will tend to go down. In better years, those soil carbons will tend to go up even with the same management applied. So we just need to be a bit careful that these aren't always positive. One last thing, so to complete this equation or the calculation of these different sources, information or data is super important, and I'll touch on that again at the end of my presentation. I want to add in another component though, and it's called Scope 3 emissions. Now, Scope 3 emissions came in 2011, so about 13, 14 years ago. The idea of Scope 3 emissions was to be able to better understand not only what happens within your farm boundary, but along the supply chain. So what are the emissions as we create products, if you like, are more and more refined? So in an agricultural sense, from our farm, we've got our Scope 1 and 2 emissions in here, but we also have Scope 3 emissions that are associated with the main products that we use in farming. So if we use fertiliser, that's been manufactured. If we use fuel, then it's been extracted and refined. if we buy in fodder and grain, then someone else has grown that and they're likely to have emissions associated with that. If we buy in livestock, they'll have emissions associated to them, getting them to the stage that we might buy those animals in. So they're called Scope 3 emissions, and they try and capture the majority of what you might call the big ticket items that we use in our farming system. The idea is, and the intention is not to try and capture every one, because, a nut and bolt that you might buy at the hardware, we're not going to know the emissions on that, but we want to try and capture what are the big ones associated with agriculture and farming. The other thing I'd say about Scope 3 emissions is that we need to be mindful that as we move further down the supply chain, what we produce is actually a Scope 3 emission for someone else in the supply chain. So if we're selling, let's say, grain to someone who processes it and turns it into pasta, or if it's barley and they malt it and use it in beer manufacture, we are a Scope 3 product for that next part in the supply chain. So we've all got an interest in actually understanding our number if we're selling products to someone else, because we are part of that system and part of that accounting. Now, as I mentioned, the Scope 3 have got some limitations. At the moment, these are very broad estimates. So, for example, fertiliser, it doesn't matter where that fertiliser has come from and who manufactured it, it's got the same carbon emissions associated with it. Often, and well, quite commonly now, emissions information isn't supplied with those purchases, but that will occur over time. We're only including those big ticket items, as I mentioned. And so there's a bit of discussion and toing and froing about how we actually account for these accurately enough across the supply chain. So there's still a bit to be worked out, quite a bit to be worked out in this Scope 3 side of things. So that I wanted to set the scene, because the calculators that we do and the information that we get back is based on that type of accounting of those gases in those forms of Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Tony asked me just to mention very briefly what are the benefits of understanding these emissions. In the areas I'm working in at the moment, the supply chain is becoming rapidly interested in what people's emissions are, primarily because of that Scope 3 thing I mentioned a second ago. If they've got the opportunity to buy products from two people and one has lower emissions than the other because it's going on their calculation when they push their product out the other end, they've got an interest in trying to find suppliers that are lower emissions. It's not very strong at the moment, but I can see that growing very rapidly over the next 5 years or so. And as well as that, from the financial point of view, there's a lot of talk within banks and with accounting on lending of people actually understanding what their emissions are. What they're focused on is a thing though called emissions intensity. So it's not the total quantity of emissions on farm. That's where we sort of first started. Everybody calculates a number and how many emissions are you producing on your farm, but quickly realised bigger farms have higher emissions. What we're really wanting to understand is how efficiently you can produce products for the emissions created. So that's where the emissions intensity bit comes in. And emissions intensity is simply the amount of emissions you produced in carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide, all converted to carbon dioxide equivalents per unit of product. And that could be a tonne of grain, it could be a kilogram of meat, kilogram of wool, litre of milk, whatever it might be. And it's this efficiency measure that the supply chain are really starting to focus in on. Once we start to look at it from an emissions intensity point of view, rather than a total emissions point of view, then we can start to focus on these productivity opportunities. How can we produce more product for the same amount of emissions? Or how can we produce the same amount of product but with less emissions? So it allows us to look at the productivity opportunities within the farming system and reflect that in our emissions intensity number. And so I'd just like to give you a few examples on that. This is our farm at home. So as Tani said at the start, my wife and I run cattle and sheep. These are our emissions going back to 2006-07. I've been a bit of a nerd on this and been in this space for about 15 years. So I've been doing the calculations over that period of time. So the orange line represents the total emissions from our farm from 2006-07 to 24-25. I just calculated these a couple of weeks ago. And you can see our emissions were around about 900 tonnes, and they're now a little bit higher than that, about 1,100 tonnes. The blue line represents the emissions from our cattle, and the grey line represents the emissions from our sheep. First point to take out of this is we've expanded the sheep side of the operation. We've leased more land and we're running more sheep as part of that, and our emissions have gone up. Okay. And this is a common thing as your businesses either run more animals or your businesses expand, your emissions are likely to expand as part of that. This doesn't include any sequestration. So in other words, taking numbers off for the vegetation we've done or the carbon that may have been captured in the soils. This is just the emissions side of it, scope 1, 2, and 3. If I just focus on the beef one, which is the blue line there, in that same period, while our beef has stayed about the same over that period, so equivalent amount of emissions over that nearly 20-year period, the amount of beef we've produced has increased by about 25%. So we've gone from producing about 60,000 kilos of beef across the farm to producing about 80,000 kilos. And we've achieved that with exactly the same amount of emissions being produced. So produced 25% more product roughly for the same amount of emissions. When you divide one by the other, you get what's called the emissions intensity graph. And this is how our emissions intensity has changed over time. So as you can see there, it was reasonably high for a period of time when we really focused in on it. We've now been able to bring that down and sort of stabilise it at around that 8.5, 9 sort of measure. Now there are benchmarks available where we can get some idea of how we're tracking. The Australia-wide benchmark for the beef industry, so this is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalents we produce per kilogram of live weight in our beef operation, sits in that range. So we were typically around that range until we started to focus in on improving our productivity, and therefore it's lowered our emissions intensity. This Australian Beef Sustainability Framework says that beef producers should be able to produce a kilogram of live weight for around 13.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. This is Australia-wide, but clearly there are going to be differences between different locations and different regions on what's achievable and what's not. Where we sit there is well below that, but we take our benchmarking or our thinking of how well we're tracking against, in this case here, the Greenham Sustainability Standard. This is a standard. Greenhams are a processor, beef processor. Part of their sustainability standard is they have one metric for carbon, and they're looking to try and have suppliers that produce beef for 9.2 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo live weight. And so in doing our calculations and seeing how we're trending over time, we've got a good sense that we're in the ballpark of what some of the processors are now looking for their suppliers to be delivering on. Now, how do we drop from that or increase from 60 to 80,000 kilos and keep the emissions same? It's been through productivity, a focus on productivity and trying to make how we operate our business more efficient. And there's a few fundamental things I'll just touch on which has driven this to go down. Richard Eckhart will say there's no silver bullet to get it down, but there's silver buckshot, which means there are lots of little things that you can do, and when you put them all together, they actually make a meaningful difference or a measurable difference in how you're tracking. So if I look at these productivity drivers, and as Tani said, I've been an agronomist for nearly 40 years now. My job on the farm is basically to try and grow as much pasture as we can. And so a combination of lots of high quality pasture. So the more I can grow and the better the quality that pasture is, the faster we can turn off animals. And that's made a huge difference. So my focus is how much of this really good quality stuff can we grow? Combined with that, so the little diagram on the right, a little picture on the right-hand side, behind those steers is a thing called an optiway. We've got into these in the last couple of years. The animals walk into it, put their front feet on it, so you get an instant understanding of the weight of that animal on a daily basis. So we can now track live weight gains of those animals over time. And last year we started using this in moving animals slightly earlier, because what we found was if they were in a paddock, say for 7 or 8 days in their typical rotation, for the first few days they'd be gaining 1.5 kilos a day. Day 6 or 7 they might gain 1 kilo. Day 8 they'd gain half a kilo. Day 9 they'd wouldn't be gaining much at all, and that's typically when we would have moved them. We then decided that as soon as that graph started to tip over, we'd move them, and then we brought wethers in behind it to tidy up the pasture. Cut a long story short, a dozen of those moves where those animals were growing faster over that period meant we got a truckload of steers off to the feedlot 6 weeks earlier at target weight and got an extra 50 cents a kilo for them because we could get them earlier entry when other people didn't have stock there. That's purely a productivity thing, but it is reflected in the emissions intensity number that we calculate because we got animals up to weight 6 weeks earlier. So they were off our farm 6 weeks earlier, which meant we didn't have 6 weeks of emissions booked against us, but we got the same amount of live weight being turned off. So I think there's enormous opportunity in our pastures and our grazing management, even though I've worked in that space for 4 decades. Second area is around genetics. And obviously the genetics around growth is an important one, but 2 others that Fiona's really focused on. One is getting early calves on the ground. So we're very big we've got very tight joining now, half of which is AI, fixed time AI, but we only do 2 cycles and get 93, 94% for our pregnant cows in a 6-week cycle, which means animals are turned off earlier. They're more even in their weight range, which means we can market them and sell them off earlier. Another one, which I think has gone completely under the radar, is that as we've chased growth over the years, our mature cow weights of our animals have increased. We're involved with Breed Plan and with the Angus Society, and we've been with it for 30 years now. Over the last 35 years, the average cow weight's gone up by about 100 kilograms. So our cows are bigger, basically. We've bred for faster breeding animals, faster growing animals, and part of that is we've got bigger mature animals. And so Fiona's put a lot of pressure to try and select fast growing animals, but at the same time try and find genetics that allow our cow size to be smaller. So our cows are smaller than breed average, even though our growth rate of our animals is above breed average. A 50 kilo difference in mature cow weight is 7% difference in your emissions. So when we focus on some of those types of things, we can actually pull some levers that are going to help us reduce those emissions. And the same thing applies for sheep as well. Animal health is an obvious one. If they're not healthy and they're not growing as fast as they can be, or some of them die, then obviously that's going to cost you. And the last one is that we've been much stronger now on not just hanging on to animals for a period of time until we get round to selling them. They move off the property very quickly if they're not going to be productive and part of the long-term plan that we've got. So any cow that loses a calf, anything that's dry gets moved on straight away rather than hanging on for a period of time. So they're the productivity drivers that have driven that 25% change over time. If I now turn my attention, so that's one thing to drive productivity. The other one is to start to think about what technologies or what things might be about to help lower our emissions. And a combination of things. One is that we're really interested in what's going to happen with some of these new species that are available. So people might be familiar with those 2 photos. Left-hand one is chicory. The other one's plantain on the right-hand side. They have tannins and oils in them, which has been shown to reduce emissions by 15 to 20%, around about that sort of range. And also changing the ratio of protein to energy. When I mentioned before that animals that get too much protein in their diet produce more nitrous oxide when they urinate that out. And so trying to balance up the ratios of protein to energy is being worked on at the moment. At the moment, you can't show these in the calculators that are about, but those different species are on the horizon, and we will be able to integrate them fairly soon. There will be genetics around, because we do know there's quite a big variation in the amount of methane an animal will breathe out. 2 animals might breathe out very different amounts of methane eating exactly the same pasture. And by the end of the year, I'm told that there will be some EBVs on lower methane for cattle. Sheep's a little bit further behind, but they will be coming relatively soon. So we can select animals that produce less methane for what they eat compared to others. And we're also keeping an eye on some of these things around the rumen modifications. So Asparagopsis was one that's going to be a little while off yet. I think there's another thing called 3-nop or Bovair, which is available. They're talking about vaccines and other things and so on. So there are going to be, in the future, some of these emission lowering things. So our first bit of our focus has been on how do we squeeze the most out of the productivity that we can. And then our next phase, as you probably saw in that line the last few years that it flatlined, we're going to have to rely on some of these emission lowering technologies and introducing those into the farm business to keep that going down and to lower our total emissions over time. Last one before I get to the calculators, just on the sequestration. So this is a picture of our farm. So our farm runs down from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. That's Swan Bay and then Port Phillip Bay. Apart from that, so we're right on the coast of the Bellarine Peninsula there. Most of the trees you see in that picture we've planted over the 35, 40 years that we've had the place. We've sort of parked the sequestration thing at the moment. Even though we're capturing quite a bit of carbon in all our trees, we think we've got a lot of other positive benefits from those. Carbon, trying to sell the carbon out of that isn't the most important one on our mind. But all I'd say is that all of our carbon inputs come from photosynthesis. So when I mentioned growing more pasture, that's our primary way of being able to inject more stuff into the soil, is by growing more pasture. And more revegetation on the farm is capturing that and storing it in trees. And so both of those we're interested in. It just hasn't been our focus to try and capitalise on that for purposes of wanting to say our net emissions are lower at the moment. So that sort of finishes off the general talk. Now, if I just move on to the calculators, which Tani asked me to sort of speak about in the next 10, 15 minutes. Some people will be familiar. There are calculators that Richard Eckhart and his team at the University of Melbourne, through their Primary Industries Climate Challenges Centre, have put together. They are enterprise specific. They're called GAF tools, Greenhouse Accounting Framework tools. What's important about this is the way these tools have been put together is that they align with the way Australia calculates its emissions and the way Australia represents those emissions to the rest of the world. So there's a standardised way of calculating emissions, and these calculators reflect those. The downside with them is that they are Excel based, and while most people are probably familiar with Excel, it has the problems of Excel of how you do calculations in them. You can override formulas, you can delete things that you don't want to delete. At the moment, they don't integrate a whole farm system. So if you've got livestock and cropping, you actually have to run two calculators. You can only run these for 1 year, and then the next year you've got to do another calculation. And as you probably see there are different versions of them. So V, whatever the number is, means that there are different versions. So they're constantly changing all the time. And a calculation you may have done 3 years ago in an old version would give you a different number now if you put it in the new version. So they have the limitations of them being static Excel tools. Been fantastic for us to start with and to get a bit of a handle on the number, but they have limitations. The new one that's about, and it's evolving at the moment, it's available, you can use it, is this, what's called the Environmental Accounting Platform. And it's been developed by a group called Agricultural Innovation Australia, which is a not-for-profit company with money coming from all the research and development corporations, because I've said we need a standardised way of being able to do these calculations. It seems silly that each industry's got its own. We need to do something. We need to address that issue of how do we keep the updates going? How do we roll in from 1 year to the other? So, cut a long story short, this is available now. It's an online thing. It's free. Couple of things that I'll just mention to you. There's a little thing there. It's got the National Farmers Federation data code certified. That simply means that you have to opt in to share your information. So it's the default isn't that they take your information and use it unless you give people specific permission to use your data. They can't use your data. It's got a login up the top here. You create an account and log into that. It's still evolving, and so there's a lot of work being done behind the scenes right at the moment. And there's a lot of things that it doesn't do yet that we've been promised that it will do. something that I think will really evolve out of this is you can invite other people to look at your numbers and share those numbers. So it might be people in the supply chain or an auditor. It's also got the promise that it will allow you to have an independent person if we go down this path of verifying your numbers. So if you've made a claim that my emissions are such and such, you could have an independent person come in, check over those numbers. It would then generate a certificate that would go with you to say these have been verified as true and reasonable numbers. So it's got some real benefits that the Excel tool doesn't provide at the moment. Tanya asked me to try and give you just a little bit of a snapshot or a demonstration of that. So I'll stop sharing this screen. Because you've got to log in and it's got different verifications and things like that associated with it. I've already started one of ours at home, if I can find it, which I think is that one. Now, can I just get a thumbs up, Tani, if you can see a map of our farm? Okay.
Yep, all looks good, Cam.
Beautiful. All right, thank you. So when you first go in, you set up your farm and you click on your farm boundary. And the way this comes up is when you first go in to set it up, it comes up as land title parcels and you just click on those. So it's a quick way of being able to draw your farm. You can actually import stuff into it to do your farm boundaries as well. But I've just clicked on this to make it simple. One of the reasons for, or two of the reasons for wanting to be able to do this is, first of all, the intention is that because then it knows your location, it will bring in certain information that will automatically populate questions that are asked in the calculator, particularly ones around the leaching of nitrogen if you're in a rainfall zone that's above 600 millimetres rainfall. So at the moment, the model is that if you live somewhere where your average annual rainfall is above 600 or you irrigate, it just automatically says you lose nitrous oxide off your farm. Even if you've got a dry year, it'll still tell you that you've lost it, where this now will be able to adjust for that and bring in what the actual climatic conditions were like in that year and therefore be able to adjust that on-off switch, if you like. Excuse me. The second thing it'll be able to do is the function over here called map shapes, and it will allow you over time to map things like tree plantations, map individual paddocks. And if you map a tree plantation, it will then allow you in the future to be able to run what's called the full cam model, which will give you an estimate of carbon capture in your trees. And because it knows where you are and it can pick up the soil type, it will run that automatically. So you will just map your plantations and then it will be able to do, in the future, it'll be able to do those calculations for you. So instead of it being generic ones, which is what's in the GAF tools, this will be specific for your farm and your plantations that you've got, which I think will be fantastic. So you've got your farm boundaries on there. Then you can map areas within farm boundaries if you want to. Then if you go into business activities, this allows you to build your farm with whatever enterprises you've got on it, unlike the GAF tools, which are already fixed. So if I go into my business activities, in this one here, I've picked, and so I've made a selection that I've got 2 beef herds. I've got a spring calving herd as we've got, and we've got an autumn calving herd as well. So it allows us to separate and think about those 2 operations separately. We've got one sheep, it should be flock, not herd, but they call it a sheep herd as part of that. And also down here, you'll see that pasture is actually considered another enterprise. And the reason why pasture in this case is considered another enterprise is that as we go forward, and as I mentioned, some of those emission lowering pastures that we might have, if you've got those on your farm and you've mapped those on your farm, it will then give you the credit for having those on your farm, where the GAF tool just says all your pastures are exactly the same. So in future, it will allow you to identify where those paddocks are, where those pastures are, and the calculator will automatically incorporate those emission lowering pastures as part of it, which as it evolves, I think is going to be absolutely fantastic. It does it on an annual basis, but you can pick whatever time period you want, unlike the GAF tool, which is fixed from July to June. If you think January to December, then you would start on the 1st of January and you go through to the 30th of December. These are annual calculations that are done. If I just go into our beef herd that I've got here, and if you wanted to add another herd, you just click on it there. I've already created these herds. This is our 23, 24 numbers. And if you click on that pencil there, then it allows you to pick the different classes of stock that you've got. And so classes of stock you don't have, you just turn off and on, and it just disappears out of the calculation. So you're not overwhelmed by 50 columns when you're only using 3 or 4 of them. We then can edit within each of those. So if I look at my breeding cows and I go into that, it's set up in a way that allows you to do 2 things that are super important to get a reasonably accurate calculation. The first one is you need to know the number of animals you've got each month and how they change. The second one is you need to know the weights and the weight changes of those animals. The way this has been set up is that you can track from month to month those calculations, and it will automatically populate the next month down. So if at the start of the month, if I'd put in here that an animal had died, so I put in their change and I put -1 because one of those cows died in July, it would automatically change that to 107, and it would then flow through the whole system. When you buy and sell animals, you put them in the transaction box in here, and it allows you to say, is it a sale or is it a purchase that you've done in that month, the class of animal and the quantities and things like that. And so it will follow it the whole way through, which means that the calculations of your livestock numbers you've got will be far more accurate than a lot of mistakes I see people inadvertently make in trying to use the GAF tool, using the Excel-based tool. So this will certainly help in the accuracy and your creation of this. I fill ours out at home every 3 months when I do the BAS statement, because when I'm doing the BAS statement, I know my sales and I know my purchases. There's a whole lot of other information that you need in the calculator that the GAF tool asks for that you do in your BAS statement. So I'm doing it every 3 months now, and I just update all these. So if you looked at our 25-26 one that I've just set up, I've got our opening July numbers in there. And when I do my September BAS statement, I'll update the next 2 months on that. So I'm just moving forward every 3 months with the information I'm already handling by doing my BAS statement. I think that's probably all I need to say on that one. So if I go back now, so you've got those, so that's breeding stock and trading stock. And if I go back now to one more step back, in the 2 herds, the reason why I've got a spring calving herd and an autumn calving herd is obviously when we do certain things to them, when they start lambing and calving, when we sell animals is different. The weights of those animals will be different. So being able to keep them as separate mobs makes it much easier for me to understand what each one is doing. When you try and combine those 2 weights together, you've got some steers that might be 200 kilos, and then you've got little calves that have been born that are still fitting in that same category, and you've got to get average weights, and we make lots of mistakes. So it's really nicely built to be able to reduce that sort of thing. You can also put what we need, things like electricity, fuel, those sort of things. You can add those in as I said, play with those dockets when you purchase things like straw, in this case here, lupins and barley straw. We've got those sort of things in there. And then as you've built that system, you can allocate how much of this goes to each of those enterprises you've got. So if you click on here, it says this is how much hay we used, how much of that hay was used on the spring calving herd, the autumn calving herd, and your sheep flock. And so if you've got multiple ones, you can just allocate each of those on your way through, which allows you to better apportion that across your different enterprises. So if I go down the bottom, I'll just cancel that one and go back on that. So it's I think a better way to be able to include the information. What I really like too is that as new versions come out, this will automatically update to the latest version. And so you don't have to go back. So if you've put information in that's 4 or 5 years old, you've been doing this for a number of years, it will recalculate your old numbers to the current standards or the current assumptions that are being used, where you can't do that in the Excel tool. You've got to re-enter your information all the time. And it doesn't at the moment, it only does 1 year, but it will allow you to roll just from 1 year to the next to the next. So if you've got the same type of spring calving herd or whatever else, it will allow you to roll through that. The cropping one's exactly the same. You just click on all the different types of crops that you grow. And instead of just having one column for wheat, you might have red wheats and you might have some of the hard wheats that you're doing. You could separate those two out and put different fertilizer regimes and so on associated with it. And the last thing it's got then is it will calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. And it's just calculating my numbers now. Now, unfortunately, it wants to go to my last financial year. If I go last financial year, that is, I think 24, 25. Yeah, so it's clicked over another year. So I'll have to, customize this to July, oh, wrong year, sorry, July 2023 to June 2024, that's right. And so if I update that, it will do our calculations now on our greenhouse gas emissions. It's the same calculation that you'd get in the GAF tool. So if anybody's been playing around with the GAF tool, it will be the same calculation there, and it will give you your greenhouse gases and where they're coming from. If we then look at individual enterprises, so this is to get our emissions intensity. If I go to the beef one and I click on that, it will do the same calculation just for the beef operation and tell us where our emissions are coming from. And as you can see here, the vast majority of our emissions are coming from methane in that enteric fermentation, what the animals are breathing out, and not much in some of these other ones. And it breaks it down into your scope 1, whether that's methane, nitrous oxide. You'll see there's virtually no carbon dioxide we're producing here, but it then gives you this emissions intensity number. Now, at the moment, this is the emissions intensity number excluding sequestration, so we haven't factored in any of the trees or potentially any of the soils as we're going. I think that covers it off, Dani, so I might stop sharing and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cam. We have a couple questions coming through in the chat. One I might ask you now, which is Matthew Coop has asked, where do emissions from diesel machinery fit? And I think that was in regards to scope 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah, so most of them will appear in your scope 1 and 2. So your on-farm stuff, as you burn the diesel, there is a amount for that, but the amount of diesel you buy in, so the number of litres you buy in, there is a small amount attributed in your scope 3, which is the extraction and refining of that fuel. So you'll see it pop up when you look at fuel. It'll pop up as both scope 1 emission and a scope 3 emission.
Great. Thank you so much, Cam. A reminder, if you have questions for Cam or any of our experts tonight, please just pop them in that Q&A function and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. But as always, there's a flood at the very end, so it's best to get your questions in early. I just also wanted to introduce our next speaker. Kerri, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Kerri Robson is the Executive Officer of Gecko Clan Landcare Network, and as the network facilitator for the past 16 years, Kerri's worked closely with and supported 13 landcare groups, stretching from Yarrawonga to the Strathbogies, all across Ngambie. And that's been to deliver a range of projects on the themes of sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, community engagement, and emergency response. If that didn't keep Kerri busy enough, she also lives and works on a commercial Angus breeding property with a strong focus on being a profitable business and improving the land to leave the environment and landscape in a better condition for the future. Kerri, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'll hand over to you. You're still muted there, Kerri. You might just want to come off mute.
There we go. All good. So thank you, and thank you for the invite to being a part. First, I'd just like to say that it's an amazing event where you have three Landcare, Agriculture Victoria and our catchment management authorities working together to come up and work together to deliver this whole question of carbon and how we were going to do it. So a real credit to those three organisations that are working together to help and support our farmers out there to answer this really interesting question. So I come from, I suppose, working with a lot of farmers and also being a farmer. We're in the northeast, Victoria, and our area is sort of based around Benalla and Euroa. At our properties at Warrenbane, we run pure Angus cattle, cow and calf operation, and we're a spring carver at the moment. So how it all came about was that I worked closely with Agriculture Victoria, and we were talking about identifying farmers that would do the on-farm emission action pilot program. So we nominated some farmers to do that. And when one of the farmers said to me after it, he said, well, Kerri, what's the recipe for doing this audit and emissions on farm? So if you can give me the recipe, I'll do it, but I need someone to tell me how to do it. And I thought, well, that's a very good question. I don't know how to do it. So I think I should throw my hat in the circle and have a go and do our property as well. So when starting the process and being a part of the action program, I had a lot of support through AgVic in taking us through how I was going to do it, how to do the calculation. But the real eye-opener to me was when we started, we were doing it in 23-24. It was a bit of a dry season, but we had the really great idea that we were going to do a big input on putting a lot of lime and fertiliser on the farm, and also we were buying in a lot more hay. We'd increased our numbers, so we were running a breeding herd of 120 cows, and it was a really big eye-opener, and trying to bring all the data together was the biggest challenge, and it made us realise we really didn't know what we were doing. And that to be able to collect all this data and put it into the spreadsheet was an absolute nightmare. But it really, as I said, opened my eyes to say there were rooms that we could improve. We were doing, I thought we were doing great things. We'd just converted our farm to solar pumps, and we're doing a reticulation of water around the farm. We have a moisture probe on our property, so we always knew what our soil temperatures were and our moisture. But we also were doing, felt we had, good trees. We were doing that side of it. But when it came to the holes were really big. And the biggest ones that we did notice was that, again, it's knowing what you're doing. Because if you don't know what you're doing, you can't make improvements. But the biggest hole we could see was that we weren't able to calculate our weights. We weren't grabbing that data and using that information. We were really struggling. So we operate as, we try and wean at about, we wean for our 14 days. But then also we try to sell all our steers to a repeat buyer, and our average weights were roughly about 330, 340. We were putting them off, but those figures weren't real, and we weren't really understanding what the average weights were in our herd. So our collection of data was really important. Also, our turning off weights of what our joining weights for our heifers, we weren't really having that knowledge. So we could see straight away that without having that good calculation of data and information in our weights and what we could do, we couldn't make any changes. So a part of this emission program was we identified that, and we now have installed a new cattle crush, and we're also installing a new weighing system that allow us to collect all the data when we run every animal through. So we've had to do a big change where we've had to go back and rescan all our cattle onto the farm again to clear out and tidy up our PIC data, because that wasn't up to date. The other thing we didn't do when we were doing this calculation on our property, we have 400 acres here, but we lease a lot of country, and we didn't actually calculate the lease country in, which is, I think, we have another 500 acres that we lease. So we didn't put that in the calculation, but next time what we will do is we'll put that into the program as well, to be able to, because I think that would benefit us in some way, to be able to capture the whole story instead of part of the story. So for anyone tonight thinking that, should I have a go at this? Do have a go. If you don't know what you don't have, you can't make the change. And it was, rewarding when we saw the good things, that we knew that we were doing some change and making good change. but it really highlighted the holes in the farming system and what we were doing. And Cam is a very strong person in the idea that you don't just leave the bull in. You've set a set date of your joining times, and you make sure that you move those, as you said, things that are not producing or don't need to be in the system off the property as quick as possible. And that is a program we now have in place. When we preg test, we cull straight away. We don't keep things that we think we might fatten up for another 100 Ks because the dollar price of cattle might go up. Everything goes that has to go. And then we focus on what we've got at home to make sure that they're either hitting their joining weights or they're hitting the weights that we can move them on. So yeah, it was a very, very rewarding program. That new program that Cam had that went through, I think is excellent. It will help make our next, we're due to do our next calculation. So I'll use that program because I think that really ticks a lot of the questions that we had and struggling with coming up with the weights and the data and the ages of the cattle, and also the definitions of 12 months to joining to 2 years. Yeah, so a lot of those things have got better and easier. So yeah, have a go, try it, because you can only, if you don't know what you've got, you can't make that change. And, you know, even looking at our dung beetles, you know, they're an asset on the farm. We put them in the system as well, that everything, we grabbed everything that we could. But yeah, it's rewarding, and I'd recommend to have a go. And there's a lot of support out there, like this webinar, and all the teams within your CMA and Agriculture Victoria, and are there to support you to get you through it. And it is very rewarding when you do it. So yeah, that's our story. And now I've gone back to that farmer and sat down with him, and we've done his calculations. And he's now got the recipe. So hopefully we can keep that moving on and helping other farmers. Because there's one farmer said to me, this to me will be something like, it'll be on my NLS databases. I've got my PIC number, I've done my biosecurity, and I've now done my emissions on farm audit, and it'll be just tick, 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 and there'll be another one coming along. So yeah, see it as a benefit, and it is a challenge, but yeah, it's worthwhile. So thank you for hearing my story.
Kerri, it's so fabulous for you to share your recipe and all your experiences. And if you have any questions for Kerri, please feel free to pop them in the chat. Last but definitely not least, we have Julian Carroll. Julian is a 4th generation beef producer in Mudgeonga, northeast Victoria. With his family, he operates Stellar Livestock, an Angus breeding enterprise producing herd bulls, feeders, steers, PTIC females. He's the current director of TAFCO Rural Supplies, member of the Angus Australia Genetics Evaluation Consultation Committee, and former regional chair for SALRC Central Victoria. Prior to returning to his farming roots, Julian spent 20 years in Melbourne working in the IT industry. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Julian.
Thanks, Tani. Pleasure to be here. Mudgeonga is the pronunciation you're looking for.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I knew I was going to get that wrong, even with checking you at the start of the webinar. I'd blame the nerves, but I'm a Queenslander at heart.
Yes, and the emphasis is on different parts of the word when you come down south.
Mm.
So yeah, we're just near Myrtleford, and about 50 k's south of Albury-Wodonga. I'm going to be talking, we've got a couple of enterprises, and I'm going to be talking about just our commercial enterprise. So it's most relevant to the audience. And that is effectively the family farm that's been in the family for, I think, the 4th generation. It's running on about 900 acres, self-replacing Angus breeding herd, turning off feeder steers and surplus breeders. Now, we get our carbon accounts from a different source. We participate in the Livestock Farm Monitor project. So Cam was showing us the AIA EAP tool, and there is the spreadsheets you can work in directly, and this is another way you can do it. Benchmarking is a really great tool for our business because it lets us track our progress over the years. The Livestock Farm Monitor project has been running since 1971, and this year has 138 farms in it, which we can use to benchmark our performance as well. It goes into, it shows us, in addition to our carbon footprint data, it shows us things like gross margins, stocking rates, production costs, and detail on variables like pasture costs, animal health, marketing costs, and more recently, nutrient balance and emissions intensity. So our footprint looks a lot like a lot of footprints, I guess, with 85% of our total emissions coming from methane. If you dive into the detail, you can see that it is the elephant in the room, and all of those other contributing emissions are kind of small change compared to it. So it kind of makes it pretty easy to focus on how do we maximize our efficiency, our carbon use efficiency. We do talk about water use efficiency. Now we're starting to think about carbon use efficiency. And so our focus is very much on thinking about productivity, much like Cam. So the summary of our total on-farm emissions, as Cam sort of talked about, total farm emissions aren't that useful because it's all just about the size of the farm. So not that useful for our benchmarking. Focusing in on emissions intensity, though, lets us compare big farms and small farms and different enterprises. I think the emissions, per kilogram. So there's a number of intensity measures here. You can see that at the top, we're looking at emissions per dollar income. So you can actually consider, in our particular farm, we're emitting a bit over 3 tonnes for every dollar of income that we earn. And you could consider how that stacks up to other enterprises, whether that's agricultural or not. The kilograms live weight beef sold is probably going to be the one that is of most interest to most people, and certainly most interest to the supply chain. It was interesting to see that Cam showed us that the Greenham's target is 9.2. Last time I looked, the JBS farm assurance producers were sitting on about 16, and the Irish producers are sitting on about 16. So this is telling us that in the Livestock Farm Monitor project, those 180 farms are sitting on about 17 across all of Victoria, and a bit lower in the northern part of Victoria, sitting on 15. And we're sitting on about 11. And it's also worth pointing out that these emissions intensity figures exclude sequestration, whether that's trees or soil. We don't go quite back as far as Cam. We only go back to 2021. But you can see it's pretty steady, not all over the place. The metric is inversely correlated with your cattle sales. So, the more cattle you sell in that particular time period, is going to change that. So if you have a sell-off in a drought, you're probably actually going to get a better emissions intensity figure. But if you're retaining stock, it's likely to be less efficient. I was looking through the other data, other metrics available to us through the benchmarking project to figure out, does this correlate with anything like profit or rainfall? Well, this is the one I mentioned, which is the beef meat sold. And it's beef meat sold, not produced. So it doesn't take into account your changing inventory, but it does take into account just purely your sales. So you can see in 2021, it was our higher beef meat sold year and our lower emissions intensity. Doesn't correlate perfectly, but it's about as close as any of the metrics I could find did. When we started, the obvious place to sequester carbon, or the only really opportunity to sequester carbon, was in our trees. And I was very conscious that our trees were all very young. So in 2021, our average tree age was 4.5 years old. More than half of our trees are only 2 years old. And Livestock Farm Monitor project tells us that the average tree age for Northern Victoria, last time I looked, was 46 years old. That's obviously more remnant growth. So it made me wonder, well, what's going to happen to our sequestration as our trees mature? And we were able to map this relatively easily. It's a bit of help from the guys at AgVic. And you can see that very quickly in the next 5 years, we're going to increase our sequestration nearly 6 or 7-fold. And it tapers off a little bit, but still we're increasing our sequestration as these trees mature. It's sitting pretty for 2030 by the looks of things, which was, the target we all had in mind when we started having this conversation. I guess the bad news is, though, that it does tend to trail off, and this has been the finding for, people like Jigsaw Farms that have been doing this for way longer than us. They got to net zero for their enterprise and then lost it as their trees started to age. And this is what will happen to us as well. So I guess I'm pulling up these slides because the message is don't try and plant your way towards net zero. Plant trees for all the other great reasons for planting trees. And we'll certainly keep doing that too. I want to talk next a little bit about the AgVic Emissions Reduction Action Plan. We took part in the pilot a couple of years ago, and like Cam, we decided to make our focus purely around productivity. Good autumn breaks are pretty hard to come by in the northeast. I reckon maybe 3 out of 10 are the ones we'd call good ones. But when they happen, we enjoy really excellent early growth rates in our weaners. And this is data from our OptiWave from 2022. And you can see that lack of growth through the autumn and winter. And it got me thinking, how can I manipulate the management on our enterprise to try and manage our way into early growth rather than depending on the seasons? So if I could kind of achieve a growth target more like this, so less flatlining in autumn, winter and more moderate growth in autumn and winter, and then really kicking in the spring like I know we always do, what would that do for our business? When I came back to the farm about 15 years ago, our feeder steer turn-off was sometime in December, at worst in January. We've got it back to October now. So what we've done on the farm is through productivity gains, we've shaved off 6 to 8 weeks. And in a good season, we can also shave off another couple of weeks. If we can achieve a red line target like this, we get to that feeder spec of about 450, 460 full, a good 4 to 6 weeks early. And when you do the maths on that, for every 14 days we get a BAA earlier, we drop 13 tonnes of emissions out of our system.